Welcome to This Week in South Carolina. I'm Gavin Jackson. This week, we talk with retiring SCDOT Secretary Christy Hall about her tenure, her agency's accomplishments, as well as the challenges that remain. Secretary Hall, welcome back.
Thank you so much, Gavin, for the invitation.
So like I said, I want to talk to you about the latest projects going on the roadways across the state. But first, let's look at your time at SCDOT. It's been quite the road. You got to SCDOT as a fresh engineer out of Clemson University in the 90s. You worked your way up to lead the agency in 2015 during a very difficult time. I want to talk to you about that time because there was a need for more money to come to the agency because our roads were so neglected. But there was also a lot of issues with leadership. There were several secretaries that preceded you that really didn't get the job done. So tell us about what it was like when you first got to the agency to lead the agency.
Oh, wow, yeah. So I was recruited to DOT straight out of college and took advantage of every opportunity that I had to really train in every aspect of the agency, whether it was maintenance, construction, finance, procurement, administration, project management, really kind of the gamut of pretty much everything we do. And then really sort of what really made a difference for me career-wise was when the agency went broke back in 2011. You may recall a time when the contractors weren't getting paid. Unbeknownst to many people in the public, power and water was being shut off at some of our facilities across the state. And we really had a cash problem at that time. We had a little less than $3 in the bank and more than $90 million in unpaid bills. And I was asked to come back to Columbia to try to help resolve that situation, which I agreed to do as an engineer coming back trying to run our finances, but took that challenge on and really I think that really sort of set myself on the course to eventually become secretary.
Mm-hmm. And when you got to become a secretary, you also came in under difficult circumstances. Like I was saying, you had some leaders that were there in and out very quickly. You got there in 2015, right after the 2014 ice storm too. So a lot going on. 2015 was the 1,000-year flood. A lot of different things happening. But what was it like when you got there in terms of what we were trying to accomplish at that point, in terms of getting more funding to the agency, which you know it needed? How did you navigate that, dealing with the legislature and at the same time pushing for the 12-cent gas tax increase?
Yeah, I mean, kind of dating back to 2011 when we had our cash issue, there was really no strategic vision for the agency, and we really, honestly, we were doing whatever we did the year before and maybe just a little bit more with no clear understanding as to why we were spending a certain amount of money for paving versus bridges versus interstate projects or even safety. It was really no good plan in place. And, we had several leaders come in and out of the agency. As you said, we had 3 secretaries in less than 2 years come in. And, when you have turnover at the top, it does affect the organization. Big organization like DOT tends to really want to run itself. It's like a big machine, a lot of good talented people, but process-driven and really was on cruise control. And then when I took the helm, it was one of the very first questions I asked as secretary is, how much are we spending on paving across the state in our annual program? And I went to 3 different people and I received 3 very different answers, which I knew immediately we had an issue because there was no alignment to what we were trying to do and what the return on that investment was. So I immediately began to set upon a path to figure out what we were doing, what that return on that investment would be, and really carve apart our financial ask that we had been making to the legislature year over year of a funding gap, really understand what was in those numbers and really carve that up and come up with what we felt like was realistic and achievable.
Yeah, because there's no way you could have gone to those guys because no one wanted to give you more money in the first place. They said that you had plenty of money, but you knew very well that you did. But if you didn't even know where the money was going or how it was being spent, you couldn't even defend the ask in the first place, let alone say where we need it more, whether that's paving bridges or widening. So how did you do that? Like, you clearly must have had a big sit down, get everyone together and just kind of see where everything was and then go from there? How'd you do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically it. You get the team in a room and you ask the questions of, how much resources are available? Where are we applying those resources? What's the return on that investment that we're getting today? In other words, are pavement conditions getting better or worse? Are bridges getting better or worse? What's our safety record looking like? What are the things that have made a difference in the state? And once you get that base conversation and set it to the side, then you look at, all right, well, where do we want to take it? What's the vision for infrastructure? And that really was what formulated the basis of the 10-year plan that we're on now, whereas we said, all right, how much money would it take to improve pavements by a certain percentage across the state? Same thing with bridges, same thing with interstate, same thing with safety. And once we calculated what those numbers were, that was the basis of what my request was to the legislature to fund.
Because that 12-cent gas tax increase translates into about, what, $800 million a year?
Yes, sir, about 800 million.
And so at this point, though, would you call that, when you look at that fight that you helped lead, that you helped win, that obviously was a big morale boost for the agency, too, to see that you were willing to fight, willing to put your reputation on line, get the agency where it needed to be, get that money in there to fix things. Because you guys were always the butt of the joke in terms of people saying, oh, the roads are always horrible. They're always horrible. Even when we have the more money coming in, people are still complaining about the roads because it is taking a long time to get them back to where they need to be. So would you say that getting that extra money to the agency was your biggest accomplishment in your career?
It certainly was one of the biggest ones for sure. My entire career up to that point had been the agency talking about how broke it was and how we needed all these additional resources. Well before I came back to headquarters in 2011, the mantra was we needed more funding to do more road work. And while there's certainly no argument that the need was always there, I would agree with the folks that have said that we weren't ready for an increase prior to formulating this plan, because honestly, as I said, when I asked the question of how much paving are we doing across the state, and I got 3 very different answers, I think that's indicative of an organization that really at that time had no strategic plan, no vision, and really couldn't articulate what the return on those taxpayer dollars was going to be. So I think really adopting and embracing that performance management approach, which is really what it is probably the biggest legacy that I will leave with the agency.
And paving, I mean, when you talk about things so simple that people know and pay attention to so much, was that a reason maybe why you started there? Because people just identify roads, that's the most immediate need, essentially?
Well, it's certainly the largest need from a financial aspect and from the network standpoint. I mean, bridges are obviously important too, but everybody rides on roads every day, and so when you think about the condition of the infrastructure, the pavement condition always is one of the first things that you think of.
And things have improved overall?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's evident when you drive the state. I mean, we certainly have a lot more work to do. It's not finished and done by any stretch of the imagination, but I think most people, when you drive, certainly the interstates and the major highways, you can see a lot better pavement across the state.
It also seems like you thrive in crisis, too. Obviously, that was a big crisis in itself, but when we talk about natural disasters and emergency response, we had a spate there, 2015 where we had the 1,000-year flood, 2016 we had Hurricane Matthew, Irma in 2017, and then 2018 was Hurricane Florence, which was a big one. Tell us about Hurricane Florence and what happened, what were some of the big issues that your agency faced and how you had to tackle those? Yeah,
I guess, I haven't always been, the best and greatest at emergency disasters. I think I sort of adapted to that role over time. And I think probably one of the biggest lessons that I had very early on as acting secretary, actually, was it was just prior, or right as the 1,000-year flood was starting to unfold. And of course, something like that, none of us had predicted the type of impacts that was going to have. But as it started to unfold and we realized that it was a major event here for the Midlands and beyond, I guess my management approach evolved, and Governor Haley was certainly instrumental in that, because one of the things that she mentioned early on in some of our briefing sessions that we have with the governor during a disaster was, don't just think about today and what you're working on today, but think about where you need to be 3 days from now, and make sure that you're planning ahead and pre-positioning things to be able to deal with the needs 3 days from now. And so I think that was an important lesson, and something that I've continued throughout my remaining time as secretary, was to try to look around that corner and anticipate things to the maximum extent you can.
But Hurricane Florence, I mean, we had the Grand Strand was about to get cut off, and you had some emergency decisions to be made, some technology that hadn't really ever been deployed. Those aqua dams that were going up. Do you have any memories from those times? I think you were actually in the field for a good bit of that too.
Yes, I mean it was very fluid, not to overuse that kind of term with a hurricane or a flood. But yeah, I mean we had analytics that were telling us that we should expect that a good portion of Horry County was going to be completely cut off from the rest of the state, and so we were facing a potential situation of several 100,000 citizens isolated away from the rest of the state, and so there were all kinds of discussions as to how are we going to maintain a lifeline to that community, whether we were going to institute an air operation with cargo jets and helicopters or pontoon bridges. I mean, you could just imagine all the planning that can go into something like that. But we eventually settled on the best approach was to identify one route, one land route, and throw everything that we can at it to try to keep it open. And so that, when we determined that that's what we were going to do, then it became how do we actually do that, given the amount of flooding that we were anticipating. So we reached out to a lot of different people, a lot of our partners at EMD, and came back with the HESCO sandfield barriers with a liner on top of them, as well as the aqua dams that you referenced, something that neither one of those we'd ever used in the state, but had heard of some other areas that had used them with success. So we threw everything at it, mobilized the National Guard to help us with it. We also secured those aqua dams actually out of Texas and California. We had a trucking company that we engaged and had them literally drive all day and all night with rotating drivers to get that material here to get it in place.
Wow. And so I'm assuming that it has now since maybe been built into our emergency response plan, knowing that is something that would work in the future should this ever happen again?
Yes, absolutely. I think this notion of making sure that you're protecting a lifeline when things are predicted to be really bad is an important lesson for DOT.
Yeah, because that was a wild storm. It just sat over the Carolinas, so all that water coming down, really flooding everything up. I don't think it ever really got cut off, but we were getting close to water, I guess, getting over some of the tops of those bridges.
Yes, we had several inches of water that actually went over 501 that was impacted by the HESCO barriers, and certainly the aqua dams did the job that we asked them to do. But I think luckily for everybody, it ended up being not quite as bad as had been predicted, but it certainly could have been, and so we were prepared to respond to it.
Has that become, I know I just asked you a little bit about that, but has that become more of a focus maybe for DOT in terms of knowing and identifying threats for the future and making sure that we are prepared so we're not maybe doing this on the fly?
Yes, we have a lot of discussions about lifelines and what needs to be protected and what should be the priorities, and making sure that we work those priorities during an event.
Because you also have overseen the lane reversals, which were always just such a third rail. No one ever wanted to deal with lane reversals because of past issues. But you've had to oversee those too. I mean, what was the difference between making sure that those actually went off smoothly versus the chaos of the past?
Well, we had actually practiced those for years, many years, and never actually put it into play until I became secretary, and then the time came.
Your problem now.
Yeah, then it was time to do it, and once the decision was made that we needed to actually reverse I-26, we immediately went about putting that into place, it did operate smoothly. From the public outside view, on the insider view, of course, there's always issues. There always is. But, we made sure that we resolved any issues at the lowest level possible so that, we were quickly able to respond to any concerns or issues and gave that flexibility to our frontline folks partnered with law enforcement to, if a certain ramp needed to be closed versus open, then they had that authority to do so to make sure that it worked and was safe. And so we were able to put it in place. It worked very well. We're glad to have that as a tool in the toolbox. I don't like to use it and prefer not to if we can avoid doing so, because it is very disruptive and very manpower intensive for an extended period of time.
Secretary, I want to kind of go back to what we were talking about with the gas tax and your legacy there, and how you worked with lawmakers to get that done. We were talking about it wasn't a matter of promising projects per se, or it was rather a matter of talking about what needed to be done, what needed to be prioritized. Can you talk to us about how you went about doing that in terms of making this 10-year plan, in terms of the urban versus rural divide that we continue to see play out a lot of ways when it comes to where all this infrastructure money goes towards? Has the system become more equitable in how you choose projects, in your opinion?
Yes, absolutely. I believe it has. So I think the blessing is that I was with DOT back in 2006, which was a time when probably one of the biggest reform efforts was put into play at DOT. And it really transformed the way that we select projects. It took the politics out of picking projects and required the agency to move to objective criteria for selecting projects. So when you look at that history kind of rolling into the question of, all right, well, if we provide additional funding, how are you going to do it? One of the core principles that I had during that whole discussion was I'm never going to promise anybody a singular project. I just felt like that was, the complete opposite of how the legislature intended for the agency to work. To, literally take politics out of picking projects and really focus more on how are we going to improve the network and how are we going to ensure that, that everybody is treated fairly. So when you look at the state, interstates is really sort of its own animal. Across the state. Not every county has an interstate, but certainly there are some differences between the urban areas that have repeated daily congestion and the rural segments that maybe don't have as much daily congestion, but still have issues with moving commerce up and around the network. So we've been very careful to make sure that when we identify, for example, on our interstate program, that we look at both the urban interstates for improvements, such as Malfunction Junction, the Gateway and 85 through 85 in Greenville, and the widening of the rural segments, such as I-26 here in the Midlands area and I-95 that's we hope to get under contract within the next 12 months. So that's been very deliberative on our part on the interstates. Bridges, really kind of a statewide, just depends on the condition of the bridges, and I believe that's how that should be evaluated. But then on pavements, we at one time did consider those on a statewide basis, but we quickly realized that there were about a handful of counties, maybe half a dozen counties that just wouldn't have been eligible to receive any paving dollars using a statewide formula. So we migrated to a formula that ensured that every single county in this state received paving funds out of the DOT budget.
So, Secretary, when you talk about bridges specifically, I know there's been a big push from the governor to give you all about an extra, $500 million or so to improve bridges just because of the state of conditions that they're facing. Tell us about the need for this money. I think the House has put about $200 million in their budget, which is going through the State House this week. The Senate still has to work on the budget, but what's the need there for the bridges? What's the concern? What's happening there?
So we spend roughly about $200 million a year on bridges, and while we have seen pretty good return on that investment so far, we've replaced roughly about 330 bridges so far in the 10-year plan. It kind of goes back to that lesson that I talked about earlier, looking around the corner and anticipating what's ahead. And so when I look ahead on our bridge inventory, I can see that we have a significant number of bridges that are aging out, that are about to exceed their life expectancy and will need either replacement or significant repair. So really this investment that we're asking for is designed to address an emerging issue that we're having here in the state, but really kind of intercept the major problem before it becomes a major problem.
Because one bridge just depends. I mean, there's some bridges that are maybe prioritized over others at this point because they are so critical in the movement of freight and people. And these aren't necessarily bridges that are not being addressed, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Well, it kind of gets to your question earlier about urban versus rural. So we recognize that our interstate bridges are critical, and we need to pay attention to those. That interstate was built really late 50s, early 60s in the state, and so we're getting close to a lot of those bridges needing to be replaced or major repairs done to those. You know, you look back at Christmas, we had the emergency closure on I-20 because we had a bridge issue. You think back a few years prior to that, we had an issue with the Wando Bridge down on 526. And, you know, like I said earlier, you know, we're always thinking of the what ifs and the lifelines in the state. So what if we had an issue with the Lake Marion Bridge? Then what's the detour? You know, 100-mile detour is significant. And we want to avoid that before it becomes a problem.
Is the Lake Marion Bridge okay right now?
Yeah, it's fine.
That's like a nightmare scenario, though. That's what you're talking about. Yeah,
exactly. You know, we have to plan ahead. But it's not just the interstate bridges. You think about our bridges in the communities and rural areas. We have 62 closed bridges right now in our rural communities, and every single one of those bridges, whether it carries 10,000 vehicles or 250 vehicles, is important to that community, and we need to address those.
So, Secretary, we have less than 5 minutes, but are we keeping up with what we need to do here in the state? I know obviously we had decades of underfunding and the need to do more, but how are we doing right now? Are we matching that pace? Are we still behind the curve, especially when you look at how the fastest growing state in the country, we have all this commerce going through our state, the ports and economic development. Are we keeping up?
Well, I think we're doing the best we can right now. You know, our emphasis has been on getting the system and the network to a state of good repair, and we're well on the way of accomplishing that. As I said earlier, not there yet, but the path is laid, and it's working towards that. We are the fastest growing state in the nation. A lot of residential booming happening all across the state in areas where we've never seen it before, and so I think that's an area that the agency and the legislature and leadership will still need to look towards to identify solutions to address those issues.
Yeah, because we look at, this joke where we talk about expansion, like just one more lane is going to fix it. If we just make one more lane, things will be fixed. But that's not necessarily the case. I know you're doing that but on 26 from Charleston to the Midlands, and that is very important too. But can you address, we can only expand so much. I mean, at what point do we need to maybe pivot or get smarter or look for different transit alternatives? Yeah,
100%, Gavin. I think in our urban areas, we're definitely going to have to look at things that can increase the flow of traffic through an area, whether it's signal timing, intelligent traffic solutions, intersection improvements, things to deal with pinch points versus major widening projects. A widening project has its place in a rural area like on I-26. It's desperately needed, but I wouldn't want to do a major widening project through the Greenville, say the downtown Greenville area, because that would be a very disruptive project. Very expensive, and then you would wonder, are you really getting that good return on that investment? So I think those kind of solutions have to be in the toolbox.
And then, of course, the major projects like Malfunction Junction, Carolina Crossroads, which was 3 years into that project, that $1.7 billion project, the biggest in the state. How is that progressing? What's next for that, and is it on track?
Yeah, so it's doing really well. So phases 1 and 2 are well under construction now and progressing very well. If you happen to drive the area, you can see it on a daily basis. Something's changing on the ground every single day out on that particular project. So we recently have resequenced that work plan for that area, and our next phase as a project will be to widen 20 and some other areas leading into the major interchange. And while we do that widening, we're going to do the right-of-way and the utility relocation necessary at the main interchange so that when that project goes to contract, the contractor can really progress that work quickly. So we're excited about it. It's certainly our biggest project to date on the interstate system here in Columbia area.
So when that's done, when 26 is wide, and we're going to see 95 also starting to get widened at the entry points too, is that right?
That's right. So we were planning to widen at least the first 33 miles and looking around the corner at the remainder of 95 all the way up.
But also road safety has been your biggest priority as well in terms of helping lower the fatalities, the collisions on these secondary routes too. What's the status of that? Have we been seeing fewer fatalities or maybe fewer collisions? What's new with that?
Yeah, so I'm excited to report to you that we've seen about a 24% reduction in fatalities in our rural areas. We believe that our rural road safety program is affecting those numbers somewhat. Of course, driver behavior is part of the solution as well. So we're excited about the improvements that we made so far, and we're looking forward to continuing that plan going forward.
So I know you don't want to speak for your successor here, your Chief Operating Officer, Justin Powell, who will be succeeding you pending the Senate approval there. But what do you see as the biggest priority now? You've done as much as you can. What do you see maybe happening in the future that he will now inherit, that he will take the ball on and run with? The biggest priority you see going forward for SCDOT?
Well, I think you've already mentioned them, right? So it's bridges, and what are we doing to deal with the growth of the state? I think those are the two remaining large issues that still need to be resolved.
Mm-hmm. And then what about what's next for you, Secretary? What are you going to be doing now in retirement?
Well, I'm going to take some time off and, of course, continue to watch you on ETV, Gavin. But, really take a little time for myself, and then I'm sure I'll climb back in the saddle doing something.
Mm-hmm. Are you going to miss the day-to-day? Are you going to miss doing all this work for the state of South Carolina?
I'm sure I will somewhat.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's retiring SCDOT Secretary Christy Hall. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gavin.
Appreciate it. And you can stay up to date with the latest news throughout the week by checking out the South Carolina Lead. It's a podcast that I host on Tuesdays and Saturdays that you can find on southcarolinapublicradio.org or wherever you find podcasts. For South Carolina ETV, I'm Gavin Jackson. Be well, South Carolina.